After massive Iranian missile strikes on Israel, a combat alert was raised across every branch of the United States military. The signal went out simultaneously to Air Force units, Marine Corps detachments, and fighter squadrons stationed at bases across the country and overseas. This was not a drill. This was not a readiness exercise. The order was real, and every service member who received it understood exactly what it meant. Combat readiness. Full deployment. Immediately, everything started moving at once. There was no slow build, no gradual ramp-up. The moment the alert hit, bases shifted into overdrive. Within minutes, Marines were being transported from their barracks to the airfield by bus. The ride was quiet. No one said much. They had trained for this moment, rehearsed it dozens of times, but when the real order comes down, something changes in the air. The weight of it settles differently. Upon arrival at the airfield, they began loading into a C-17 Globemaster 3 that sat waiting on the tarmac, its massive rear ramp lowered to the ground. The aircraft looked enormous up close, its grey fuselage stretching back into a cavernous cargo bay large enough to swallow an entire convoy. Even as the Marines filed in and took their positions, cargo handlers were still working the ramp, bringing in additional equipment on forklifts and flatbed carts. Portable generators came up first, then ammunition crates stacked and strapped onto pallets, followed by communications gear, medical supply containers, and boxes of equipment whose contents were stenciled in black military lettering. Each item was moved with purpose and speed. Nothing was handled carelessly. Everything was secured, strapped down, checked, and rechecked inside the cargo bay alongside the Marines. This aircraft had one stop scheduled before the Middle East. It would land at another military installation to pick up more personnel and additional equipment before continuing on with a full load. The C-17 was not making a single delivery. It was the first thread in what would become a continuous aerial bridge stretching from the continental United States all the way to a forward operating base in the region. At a nearby installation, several more C-17s were already in the process of being loaded. These aircraft were taking on a different kind of cargo. Cargo handlers drove armored vehicles directly up the loading ramps, the engines rumbling and exhaust rising into the hangar air as the vehicles climbed the inclines and were carefully positioned inside. Tactical buggies, armored trucks, MRAPs, and other combat-rated vehicles were driven in and then secured with heavy chains bolted to the aircraft floor. The restraints were checked multiple times. An armored vehicle coming loose inside a pressurized aircraft at altitude is a catastrophic event. Nobody was skipping any steps. At a separate airfield, a different kind of preparation was underway. Fighter jets were being brought to full combat readiness by maintenance crews who had been on the flight line since before the alert came down. These were the aircraft that would be conducting sustained strikes on enemy military targets over the coming days, and they needed to be in absolutely perfect condition. There was no tolerance for mechanical failure. Not here, not now. Every aircraft went through a full inspection from nose to tail. Avionics were checked and rechecked. Radar systems were powered up and tested. Wiring harnesses and electronics were gone over panel by panel, connection by connection. Engine covers were pulled off, intakes were inspected for any debris or foreign object damage, and fuel systems were verified. Flight control surfaces were cycled through their full range of motion. Once the structural and mechanical checks were complete, the weapons teams moved in. Air-to-air missiles were lifted onto the wingtip rails and locked securely into place. Guided bombs were mounted on the underwing pylons using hydraulic hoists. Each weapon was then connected to the aircraft's electronics. The wiring harnesses were plugged in, the data links confirmed, and the arming pins inserted. Red flags hung from each pin, a visible reminder that the weapons were still safed. Those pins would stay in until the aircraft was ready to taxi to the runway. Every weapon received a visual inspection after mounting. Teams checked the mounting lugs, the release mechanisms, and the alignment on each pylon. The process was methodical, deliberate, and repeated for every single fighter on the flight line. One aircraft after another went through the exact same sequence. Fuel, weapons, airframe, avionics, flight controls, engines. By the time the pilots would arrive for their mission briefing, every jet on that ramp would be fueled, armed, inspected, and cleared to fly. Meanwhile, at another location on the same base, soldiers were in the hangar going through their personal gear. Duffel bags and rucksacks were laid out in rows across the concrete floor, and every soldier was methodically working through a packing checklist. Uniforms, boots, and socks. Hygiene kits and toiletries. Cold weather and hot weather layers. Personal items, photographs, and whatever small comforts a soldier decides to carry into the unknown. These soldiers were not going on a short rotation, not heading out for a few weeks and then coming home. They were being deployed to a military base in the Middle East for an unknown period of time. Nobody had a return date. Nobody could give them one. The operational timeline did not exist yet because the operation itself was still unfolding in real time. At dusk, the order came to prepare for boarding. The soldiers formed up in columns outside the hangar, gear loaded on their backs and in their hands, and began marching in formation toward their assigned aircraft. The ramps were down. The interior lights of the aircraft cast a faint yellow glow across the tarmac. One by one, the columns moved up the ramps and the soldiers took their seats along the sides and center of the cargo bay, rows of men and women in full kit sitting shoulder to shoulder. Loadmasters moved through the aircraft doing final checks on cargo ties and performing head counts. Everything was verified. Then the ramps came up. The aircraft sealed. The engines began to spool. One by one, the C-17s taxied toward the runway in sequence, heavy with the weight of men and machines and the supplies required to sustain a military force in a combat zone. They rolled to the threshold, ran up their engines, and lifted off the runway one after another, disappearing into the darkening sky, navigation lights blinking slowly as they climbed away and turned east. The flight was long. Hours in the dark interior of a cargo aircraft, sitting on canvas seats, surrounded by equipment, with no windows to look out of. Some soldiers slept. Others talked quietly. Some stared at nothing. Every one of them knew what they were flying toward. Upon arrival in the Middle East, the C-17s touched down and the unloading began immediately. The ramps dropped before the aircraft had fully stopped rolling, and soldiers filed out into the hot, dry air of a region that had just been struck by one of the largest Iranian missile barrages in history. There was no delay, no pause to let the reality of the moment settle in. There was work to do. Vehicles were unchained and driven off the aircraft in reverse, rumbling down the ramps and onto the tarmac. Cargo pallets were extracted by forklifts and moved to staging areas at the edge of the airfield. Everything moved at an accelerated pace, because these same aircraft had to turn around. They would fly back to the United States, pick up more soldiers from other bases across the country, and make the trip again. And again after that. The aerial bridge was running continuously, and this base in the Middle East was the delivery point for everything coming across it. For the soldiers stepping off the ramp and onto the tarmac, this base was now home. Not temporarily in a comfortable sense. Home for as long as the operation required, and the operation had no defined end. No set timeline. No return date marked on a calendar somewhere. They grabbed their bags, followed the directions of base personnel who met them at the aircraft, and moved toward their assigned quarters. Rows of temporary structures, hardened shelters, or existing barracks depending on what was available. Whatever space existed, they filled it. On the airfield, maintenance crews worked around the clock preparing fighters for their first combat sorties. The aircraft were parked in rows on the apron, some standing under open sky, others pulled into hardened reinforced shelters designed to protect against incoming missiles and artillery. Fuel trucks rolled up alongside each aircraft and mechanics connected single-point refueling nozzles to the ports on the fuselage, pumping JP-8 kerosene directly into the tanks. Fuel flow was monitored at the truck's gauge panel. Once the tanks read full, the hose was disconnected, the cap sealed, and the truck moved immediately to the next jet. Weapons teams followed, bringing ordnance on loading carts. The sequence was the same as it had been at the stateside airfield. Mount, wire, confirm, inspect, repeat. The build-up was underway, and more flights were already inbound. The radar operators tracking air traffic in the region could see them, a steady stream of heavy transports crossing the ocean in the darkness, loaded with everything required to sustain a military campaign. The first wave had arrived. The second was already on the way. And somewhere at the other end of that aerial bridge, more buses were pulling up to more hangars, and more soldiers were shouldering their rucksacks and forming up in columns, about to begin the same journey.